What are the top geopolitical developments around the world that you need to be paying attention to right now as an investor? Because these things could have the potential to move markets dramatically. We're here with geopolitical strategist Pyotr Kurzin, who will be talking about China, Iran, the U.S., FTX, and much more. Welcome to the show, Pyotr.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be on.
Good. Yeah, I've followed your work, and we'll be talking about your work, and I enjoyed your analysis. Let's talk first about China. Big protests happening earlier in the week. I believe it's died down somewhat, but just to recap for the audience, and we'll show a video clip, protests are broken out in some major cities, mostly among Chinese students, younger people who are protesting the zero COVID lockdown measures that the Xi regime is instituting. Now, just today, I'm reading an article from The Guardian. China brings in emergency level censorship over zero COVID protests. I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this article. Chinese authorities have initiated the highest emergency responses of censorship, according to leaked directives, including a crackdown on VPNs and other methods of bypassing online censorship after unprecedented protests demonstrated widespread public frustration with the zero COVID policy. Okay, I understand it's the media's job to use hyperbole in some cases, but is it really unprecedented, these protests that we've seen?
No, I wouldn't say they're unprecedented. Well, I mean,
Tiananmen Square did happen.
Tiananmen Square, yeah.
Right.
We had July 4th massacre, or June 4th, massacre, where several hundred people were shot at by the People's Liberation Army. So I wouldn't say they're unprecedented in the entirety of China's history, but certainly for President Xi, these are the most notable public display of frustration, resentment, pent up, even rage. I would say that there was a specific flashpoint, trigger point, which basically in the state capital of Urumqi in the northwest, which is the province, I don't want to mispronounce it, but I think it's Zhejiang, which is heavily populated by the Uyghurs. About 10 people died in a horrible accident of fire, and they were unable to escape because of the restrictive COVID policies. So there are a lot of barriers, there are a lot of just restrictions on access. So right. That was sort of the tipping point for people who've already got this underlying hatred or frustration with the zero COVID policy.
Okay, Piotr, I'm looking at the news and what's been happening. Yes, the tracking of communications, the blocking of VPNs, that's nothing new with China. But what's remarkable here is that the protesters are openly on the streets criticizing the Xi regime, saying things and chanting in Chinese, things like down with the Xi regime or Xi Jinping should resign. I mean, this is a country in which citizens could be heavily penalized, both perhaps financially and or socially, for openly criticizing the government, and yet they're doing this on the streets en masse. What's emboldening these protesters?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. For your listeners, it's important to keep in mind that protests are not there's not a handbook of how to do protests, but there are a few common factors to them. So for one, protests will always be hijacked by people with other agendas. We can see this in any country. There'll be a majority of people who have one specific cause. In this case, most likely the desire of the COVID policies. But there are a few people on the fringe who are like, well, this is an opportunity to reignite that debate about pro-democracy, greater freedom and civil liberties within China as a whole. So there were certainly people chanting down with President Xi, down with the CCP, but the majority of people, I think, largely want to see the end of these COVID policies. The other factor I would just say is what's going on around you. Social media is proliferating so much of the spread of information. And so inevitably, some Chinese younger students, particularly with access to VPNs and ability to see external information, will see what's happening in Iran. And that may have emboldened people to come out in greater numbers.
We're going to talk about Iran in just a minute, but I think what people want to know from geopolitical strategists like yourself is how much further this could get. So give us some level-headed analysis here. Is this going to be the next Tiananmen Square? Can this escalate to a certain point of no control, or do you think this is just going to be brushed over in a week?
I think we've largely seen it probably calm a bit.
Okay.
At the end of the day, the CCP does have a degree of centralized control like no other. And as you pointed out in the article and just a minute ago, the CCP has two options. They can either adhere to the calls of their people and begin to sort of consider ways that they can lessen the policies, roll them back, or they can double down. And clearly they're doubling down. As I say, this is a challenge to President Xi, legacy, to his general capacity, to respond. So that doesn't mean this is going to go away, but I think I don't think we're going to see sort of an escalation and continuation in the way that we are seeing in Iran. Otherwise, we would continue to have the reports of them coming out. But right now, it seems to, at least relative to, say, Monday or Sunday, not be the same level of intensity. Of course, there'll be pop-ups and flare-ups, but I don't expect it to be this continuation. No.
All right. So I think people in the West are concerned about the zero COVID policies, especially investors, more from an investment standpoint, because they do have a direct impact on supply chains, with China being a major manufacturing hub, global manufacturing hub. Let me just highlight, just from a political standpoint, why they're doing this. We can talk about why this is even necessary for the Chinese. This is a BBC article that came out today, and here are some bullet points on what these lockdown rules actually entail. I'm just going to read a few of these. So local authorities must impose strict lockdowns, even if only a handful of COVID cases are found. Mass testing is carried out in places where cases have been reported. People with COVID are isolated at home or placed under quarantine at government facilities. Businesses and schools are closed in lockdown areas. Shops must also close except for those selling food. Lockdowns last until no few infections are reported. Okay, let's just break down what's going on right now. Why is China still issuing some of the toughest COVID regimes in the world, despite, lowering cases?
Well, I'm going to be limited in that I'm not a public health expert. But,
okay, sure.
What you've described there sounds very much what the whole world was dealing with in the early part of the pandemic, the first.
Correct.
So shall we say. I mean, China is a very centralized country. It very much wants to control every element of people's lives. The social credit system, in that way, you have this score. You can go to certain schools. You can't get certain jobs if you do something wrong. All these things are quite draconian. And I think at this point, the CCP has just had its summit. President Xi was reappointed for basically life. And he's trying to be, to a certain extent, a modern equivalent of Mao Zedong. And I think that also has to do with a certain degree of grievance and resentment that the Chinese people have. But yeah, if they continue to do this, if they continue to check people's phones for apps like Telegram, where they were sharing some of the videos which were then leaked to Twitter and so on, you're going to see, people come back out. So the CCP are, facing definitely a renewed degree of threat, and this is going to be very uneasy for President Xi. But as to why they seem to think that this is the best policy, I think it's about a certain degree of psychological control. They're used to being able to dictate to the people, this is what you should do and this is why you should fall in line. And so they resort to what they think will work again. But clearly, it's not that case necessarily. I don't want to make absolute, maximalist statements, but I do think this is what comes naturally. And so they're going to continue to do that. And with the reshuffle of the CCP upper echelons, I think that may be playing into the decision-making as well. Okay.
Let's talk more broadly about where China sits in the global arena. Now, Xi was just reappointed as the leader of the Communist Party for his third term, I believe. Tell us more broadly, Pyotr, what is Xi's vision for China in the long term, and what is he going to do to facilitate that growth, to make that vision a reality?
Oh, you're asking me to create a lecture series. It's a very well.
Summarize for us in a few minutes,
if I could
answer please.
That, I would be yes. I think that President Xi he came into office in 2012 after his predecessor Hin Jintao, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who was a bit more moderate. He was a bit more willing to engage in the West in a sort of more open way, but President Xi has shifted to what the West have coined wolf warrior diplomacy, which is basically up until the 2010s, you could argue, give or take a few years, of course, China was more willing to sort of just remain a bit more passive. Now it's much more assertive in its ambitions. It wants to not just sort of go along with things, but it actively wants to influence them. And we can see this through its creation of the BRI and various projects. We can see this through their flyovers with Taiwan. We can see this in the general rhetoric that they're pushing in the UN or other, global platforms, say the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. Them establishing a defense deal with the Solomon Islands earlier this year is indicative of what they want to do, which is be much more of an active leader in not just the globe, but in their respective region. That being said, there are debates about, does China want to replace the United States as the global leader, or does it simply want to level out the playing field for more, competition, for greater balance? Because the US has obviously been the prevailing hyperpower for the past 20 or 30 years, give or take. So now you've got different circumstances where China is taking it to the US in a few areas. And President Xi is at the hub of that. His history, his personal background, I think, plays into that quite a lot. And he wants to basically accomplish what's known as national rejuvenation, which is basically to rekindle the glory days of China and repair the damage of what the Chinese call the century of national humiliation. And as part of that, it includes reincorporating Hong Kong and also Taiwan. And now Hong Kong has largely happened, but Taiwan remains a much tougher project. And that's why you see these activities around it.
Okay. Let's talk about Taiwan, because that is a hotspot, and some other geopolitical strategists I've talked to have indicated to me that Taiwan, should that area get out of control, may be, in the worst case scenario, a stepping stone towards another world war. Now, that obviously is an extreme scenario, but break this down for us, Pyotr. How likely is it that we will see a hot war between Taiwan and China and any allies that proclaim to stand in Taiwan's defense, and what that means for the global arena of stability and peace?
Sure. I'm not an alarmist. I will do everything I can to ensure that what information I portray is measured and reasonable.
Sure.
However, I do remain concerned by the potential of, shall we say, some form of kinetic war over Taiwan. I don't think it's imminent, just because the Chinese have been watching with a great degree of, obviously, interest and awareness Russia's campaign in Ukraine. The Taiwanese, were there to be a hypothetical war, and I want to reiterate this is hypothetical, would be very different. It's an island with a maritime campaign, which would be incredibly different to the terrestrial invasion that the Russians have undertaken into Ukraine. The maritime strait or cross strait between mainland China and Taiwan is, I think, the second busiest shipping lane. It's about $5 trillion worth of commerce goes through there annually. So it's incredibly important internationally, obviously. The other thing is that the Taiwan Relations Act, which the Americans established with the Taiwanese, actively states that the United States will come to some form of defense of Taiwan in light of a, aggressive maneuver from the Chinese. There's a lot of gray area here. So I want to make sure that people understand that the US has maintained what's known as strategical ambiguity, which means it doesn't take a specific explicit position on Ukraine, on Taiwan. It acknowledges China's position and it acknowledges Taiwan's position, but it tries to balance, because acknowledgement is simply, well, we hear you, but we don't agree or disagree with you, or we're at least not telling you where we sit. So the potential for this is possible, but it would be very difficult for the Chinese to undertake. And there are a lot of allies and partners in the region that have made it very clear they would come to the defense of Taiwan as well. So we've got the Japanese with the third largest navy. Not many people know that. The South Koreans, the Australians, the British, the Germans, the French are all around that area. So this would be a very internationally, set of actors going up against one likely singular actor, which, whilst very competent, is, so it would be a pretty intense conflict. But I think there's also a difference between taking Taiwan and keeping it. Yes. The island is very topography-wise difficult to conduct, like amphibious landings, and you could likely see some kind of guerrilla warfare, or, think Cuba of the 1950s, 60s, with a lot of underground movements and supply chain from the West as well. But these are all scenarios which I think we need to keep in our mind, but they're definitely not on the immediate horizon.
Okay, so let's role play, or let's strategize here for a minute. Suppose China were to invade Taiwan by force because they deem it necessary for whatever reason. The American audience watching our show right now is probably wondering what the U.S. response would need to be. Now, I'm getting mixed messages from what I'm reading because the Taiwan Relations Act, which was enacted in 1979 and has been effective ever since, does not explicitly state that the U.S. needs to come to Taiwan's defense militarily should a breakout of war happen in that region. In other words, if China invades, they're not obligated legally by bounding contracts to come to their defense. However, President Biden has said in September, and I quote this Reuters article, U.S. President Joe Biden said U.S. forces would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. Is he amending the Taiwan Relations Act, or is this just bluster?
No, I mean, I'm not going to get drawn into too much with listeners about, Biden's competency as a president. But what he has been doing is, partisan politics. But what Biden has been doing, I think, is a degree of signaling. When we talk about diplomacy, particularly concerning game theory and war games, at least scenario playing, is signaling optics is very important. So the messaging, even if it's implicit, can have as much of an influence as direct, explicit statements. Think, Theodore Roosevelt carrying a big stick. You don't have to use it, but having it is quite indicative, right? So for Biden's comments, he's not just said it in September. He said about 4 or 5 of these now, as early as I think August of last year after Afghanistan. But in my opinion, what I think he's doing is subtly signaling to the Chinese, because we've seen more flyovers. We had what some people coined the 4th Taiwanese crisis earlier this year, when they had amphibious vessels around the island as well. The last one being in 95, 96. I think this is Biden implicitly stating to the Chinese, look, we aren't officially changing our policy, but the more that he goes out on a whim, and as the president of the United States suggests that, we will support Taiwan, we'll come to Taiwan's aid, I'm paraphrasing. What do? He's able to signal to the Chinese, to the Communist Party, the willingness that America will have to stand up for democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, that sort of thing. But equally, then the White House always rolls it back. They're like, well, President Biden said this, but we haven't officially changed our policy from strategical ambiguity in the One China Act or two systems, one China, whatever I forget the acronym for a second. But yes. The point being is, I think he's doing it deliberately, a little bit, just to keep them on their toes. But officially, and also after Ukraine, the West needs to really be assertive in their response. And while China hasn't done anything kinetically, the use of diplomatic messaging is still very important.
Yeah, you brought up Ukraine, which is very, very important. We'll talk about that right after this question. But I do want to point out that Putin has invaded Ukraine and then issued very strong statements, indirectly threatening nuclear war should the West directly intervene with boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now, of course, there is no official binding contract to defend Ukraine militarily because Ukraine is not part of NATO. But let's draw this parallel to China. Could she not test Biden's or any president's resolve by doing the same thing and threatening nuclear war? Why would any Western country go to nuclear war with China over an island?
It's a very good but intense question. You're putting me on my toes today. I think, for one, there's a few reasons here. The CCP have never threatened the use, at least from what I can remember, the use of nuclear weapons. Up until this point, they maintain a protocol that is known as minimum deterrence. So basically, the Chinese Communist Party have kept around, I think it's 220 nuclear warheads throughout since the late 1960s, whenever they first tested them. America and Russia, by equivalent, have several thousand. Just for example, Russia has actively about 1,500 nuclear warheads ready to immediately be used if possible. I mean, there's a lot of protocols, so it's not like there's a lot of DEFCON levels to get there. But the point is, actively ready to launch. Whilst China, I highly doubt all of their 225 are actively ready. That being said, this has been a bit shifting. And the Chinese have been thinking that if they want to be taken as equivalent as a major power in the world, they're going to have to increase their stockpile, just from, again, a optics point of view. But the other reason I think, and this is more my opinion than it is sort of, based on 100% fact, is North Korea. China, Russia, and America over North Korea is largely where you've seen some degree of agreement, particularly in the UN, when they've continued to sanction and there's no veto, there's no abstention. The three countries clearly, are against North Korea. But given China is North Korea's closest partner, if China suddenly starts shifting its nuclear rhetoric, that's highly unlikely to go down well with, Russia and Russia particularly as a partner, and North Korea. The last thing you want is an emboldened rogue state in your northeast corner thinking, well, if China's normalizing the use of nuclear weaponry talk or threats, well, then we can do that too, and that puts China in a major threat because they border the country. So I don't think the Chinese would do that. But
in the case of North Korea, they've been using that rhetoric and never really followed through yet.
No.
Fingers crossed they wouldn't. All right, let's talk about Iran now. Protests have been breaking out, and some fear that this may be the end of the current regime. Of course, that's an exaggeration, an extreme scenario. Break down what's happening for us and what you think is going to likely progress from here.
Yeah, so the protests slash revolution, depending upon who you ask, have been going on for about 70 days now. They started over a young girl called Mahsa Amini, who was basically beaten by what's known as the morality police, which is a long-standing specific segment of the law enforcement within Iran. And this basically erupted into women leading these widespread nationwide resistance movements and publicly denouncing the Islamic Republic, Islamic regime. And since then, they've blossomed into just general protests and rebellion about the regime as a whole. They want regime change. And this is where the difference between the Chinese protests and the Iranian rebellion, as I'm calling it, is very clear. The Iranian rebellion is much larger scale. It's much more with a clearer, systemic change than it is within China at the moment. Obviously, we can't predict everything. Generally, these are the regime is very well established. It does have, connections all over the world, a lot of proxies. So this makes it very difficult to just usurp the regime. And so whilst people are really making them feel pressured, these are the biggest, resistance movements, we could say, since 2009, if not, in some cases, 1979. But things are moving quite quickly. We had the burning of Evin Prison, which is a famous place for political opposition, a few weeks ago. And right now, the main thing I would say, the mainstream media hasn't been covering as much, but they continue. And the regime is threatening, public executions and assassinations of any young and outward-speaking people, actively just basically. And they're doing this as a way to try and quell the uprisings. They did this in the 80s. Several hundred, if not thousands, of people were personally, publicly or targeted with, life, accusations and things. So right. I think we're seeing this happen again a little bit now. There are a few other things which this is having impacts on, such as the Iranian nuclear deal. But we can talk about that if you want.
Well, I do want to ask you. We'll link that to my next question. So, Iranian nuclear deal, how that's going to be affected. But more broadly speaking, some people are wondering whether or not this can escalate to become the next Arab Spring. From the reports I've been reading, this does seem to be unifying several ethnicities within Iran itself.
Well, I mean, the Arab Spring was a cross-border, development that occurred initially within Tunisia, and then it spread to Libya, Egypt, and Syria, and so on. Iran's very different to the Levant and North Africa, mainly because it's a lot older. In some ways, it's a different interpretation of the Quran. It's a different, just general societal makeup. Iranian people are, very intelligent, and not saying that the other countries aren't, but I think the differences there are quite clear. Equally, I think that this is, yes, you're right. There's a degree of unifying factors with this. However, the Islamic Republic are targeting minorities. They've been targeting Iranian Kurds. Azerbaijani Iranians in the northwest have also been, getting caught up in this. So there's a lot of different, I think, narratives going around. But given the just distinguished position Iran has in the Middle East relative to some of its surrounding neighbors, I wouldn't say this is an Arab Spring in the sense of it's going to spill over into other countries. I mean, Afghanistan has basically been retaken over by the Taliban. I highly doubt that's going to, if it were to, I'd be quite surprised just because of the different societal makeup of the two countries. I think this is going to remain a somewhat, at least for the rebellion point of view, somewhat internal affair. However, were the regime to be toppled and there to be a replacement government, say the Crown Prince, then that could have repercussions across the Middle East for more constructive reasons. If we go for a good scenario here, because they stopped supporting a lot of proxies and stuff, but we're still, as I say, a long time away from sort of really seeing the regime toppled.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on and talk about Ukraine now. Latest developments of the Ukraine war. Please give us some highlights. Now, Russia has appeared to retreat from the region of Kherson, which matters a lot because it's one of the first regions they've taken. President Biden has said that he would meet with Putin only on the condition that he discusses or is willing to negotiate with NATO, but he doesn't have any immediate plans to contact Putin directly. So what's next?
Well, a lot has happened in Ukraine for viewers if they've not been following it since, say, September. Kherson is the only major city that the Russians took in the south of Ukraine back in March, April.
Yes.
And they held it for a long time. They withdrew from there because they were basically, for military, enthusiasts, their back was up against the wall, i.e. a river, Dnieper River, and the Russians thought it was better to just withdraw and not be cornered. These are some of the Russians' best forces, some of their most skillfully trained compared to the conscripts and others that have been involved in other fronts, say in the northeast. The pushback by the Ukrainians came after the astoundingly quickly and unexpected northeastern counteroffensive around Kharkiv. But now we're in this, I'd say, a bit of a lull period. The main developments have been continued artillery strikes and shelling by the Russians across the country indiscriminately. And you may have seen, some of your viewers may have seen an image of Europe at night, a satellite image of much of Europe being lit up, but Ukraine noticeably dark. And this is obviously, as we enter the winter period, very concerning. It gets really bloody cold in Ukraine at this time of year. And so this is obviously going to be a major concern. There's also been scares around the deliberate targeting of nuclear plants. Both sides, blame the other for that. But clearly we're in also a notable diplomatic re-emergence, in the sense that Biden's comments yesterday evening, on Thursday, stating that, he is open to talking with President Putin, need to be contextualized. What I mean by that is that there are basic, musts, demands that the West, Ukraine, NATO, whatever you want to frame it as, require. The Putin came out and rejected Biden's invitation or suggestion by saying, well, first you have to recognize our 4 annexed territories. So these 4 include Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Luhansk is basically 100% controlled by the Russians at the moment. Donetsk, about 95%. Zaporizhia and Kherson, however, they are very much up in conflict. And so for Putin to say, well, you've got to recognize these independent states, they're part of Russian territory or they're just sovereign new territories, is obviously not going to happen because they're being fought over. The Russians have lost about half of the territory that they gained since the beginning of the war. So I think what you're going to see for the next couple of weeks, maybe month, is continued mentions floating the idea of diplomatic engagement, because in diplomacy, even sharing the idea of diplomacy and diplomatic talks again sends a message to other countries and observers about what's happening. You don't have to necessarily engage in the talks with a end point in sight. But for countries that are neutral or not sure where to stand on this issue, if they see that the Ukrainians are taking more of a honourable position by trying to engage or at least suggest talks, whilst Russia's just like no and continuing to shell and cause economic instability and recklessness, then that may make Ukraine look, from a narrative standpoint, more responsible.
All right, I'm going to ask you one more question on Ukraine, and we'll finish off the interview with another topic. Now, I'm going to ask you a loaded question. This question seems to have different answers depending on who you ask and what sources you look at. But just from a military standpoint, Pyotr, is Russia currently winning or losing the war?
This is a war that has killed tens of thousands of people, be them civilians or military. This is a war that has caused energy prices and food prices and everything to surge, and many people to be, losing their own lives in the winter. So no one wins when a war starts. What you have to measure it by is who's closer to their strategical objectives.
Yes.
The Russians are not closer to theirs. Their ideal goal would be to have taken over the entirety of Ukraine, remove Zelensky, install a more pro-Russian government, and essentially try and make Ukraine more like Belarus, a bit of a sort of vassal state, a bit of a puppet state, a buffer state between them and NATO. Because at the end of the day, they say their issue is with the continued enlargement and encroachment of NATO. So I wouldn't say the Russians are winning. They definitely need to still be treated with a degree of, obviously, wariness, because they're still a massive force. But in terms of the competency, Ukraine is doing we can see that from their training and just the general capacity for them to take back control of so much large areas. So I wouldn't say anyone's winning. I would just say the Ukrainians are more on course to retake what the Russians have occupied.
The next step that Ukraine is aiming to accomplish is to join NATO. Zelensky has formally applied earlier in September. How likely is this to happen?
It's not, because people who seem to think you can join NATO overnight don't understand that there's a long-standing process. You have to get your military to be up to the level of competency. You have to remove a large array of corruption. You have to have a certain integration of comms and interoperability. For example, Bosnia has taken over 10 years to be able to join NATO as a full-fledged member. You can have different phases, like you can have what's known as MAP, which is basically a term where you're integrating you're implementing. First, you have a phase where you map out the issues or the differences, divergences between an applicant state and NATO's membership. Then you have the implementation phase where you take time to align those things, and then you can join. It's the same with the EU. You have to take time to actually. So it could happen. I don't think it should happen. That's my opinion. I think Ukraine would be better off focusing on EU membership. And I think it could happen, as I say, but it won't happen for a while. And equally, because we have two countries, Turkey and Hungary, which are preventing Sweden and Finland, who are already on the same level of operation with NATO, from joining. So I find it highly unlikely that they would just allow Ukraine to join overnight anyway.
All right. So finally, let's talk about some of the biggest geopolitical risks that investors need to be watching right now. We talked about Iran, China, Ukraine, and Russia. Of course, there's the FTX fallout, which regulators all over the world, including at the G20 summit, have talked about. And of course, people all over the world are starting to look into deeper and more strict crypto regulations. What, if anything else, is on your radar that could move markets dramatically?
Well, from a geopolitical, geoeconomic lens, I think we have to stop looking at. Some people, I think, have a habit of looking at crypto quite in a silo, yes, because of the developments of FTX, but also just generally, it's obviously gathered a lot of attention in recent years. It's going to be more, well, people say it's mainstream or on the fringe. No, you're very much in the center now. And this can be referenced by the G20 summit that was about 2 weeks ago. Interestingly, it was brought up by India. India has one of the biggest issues when it comes to money laundering and even terrorist financing. So cryptocurrencies account for about 20% of international terrorist funding. Now, I understand that obviously most of it occurs in fiat currency in the US dollar, but for a thing that didn't exist even 15 years ago, to already account for a fifth of that funding is quite a lot. So India raised this as a concern in that they want to see a greater sort of development of a not necessarily really, really heavy draconian regulation. So I want to reassure your listeners and viewers, but in that a skeleton framework. shall we say, I think personally that it would be beneficial to have a broad set of guidelines that countries can adhere to, or at least reference on how, because at the moment crypto is seen by many as very risky, so they don't even allow crypto mining or certain things to occur, and so opportunities are being lost there, with many countries not even open to the idea. So this was touched upon by several countries at the G20 summit. I'm not entirely sure yet how far that's going to go, but the last thing I would say is that the FATF, or Financial Action Task Force, was quite active on the sidelines of this, from what I understand. And again, it mainly focuses on the areas of money laundering and terror funding. So that's sort of the geopolitical lens I can add to that.
Thank you, Pyotr. That was a very thorough analysis, and I appreciate your time. Before we go, where else can people go to follow more of your work?
Oh, well, thank you. It's I'm available on Twitter. I do a lot of Twitter Spaces, which I then convert into podcasts. So my Twitter handle is PKURZIN, my surname and first initial. And then my podcast is called The Global Gambit, GAMBIT, where I've hosted guests like Francis Fukuyama and others. So if people are interested in a geopolitical lens, which I like to focus to the markets as well, they can find me there. And I do have a Substack as well, which they can just find by searching for my name. And I will be launching a YouTube channel soon as well. So maybe people
nice.
can...
So it's going to be podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, I presume, and then also the YouTube channel.
Yeah. You can find it on all major directories: Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts.
All right. Well, we'll definitely follow up on that. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you for watching Kitco News. I'm David Lin. Stay tuned for more, and don't forget to subscribe.